Hello there. It's been another wonderful journey and I believe you have been good. I'm very excited in this wonderful time again to discuss what we have come to realize to be steady insights. I'm very optimistic you have been gathering very important information from our discourse so far. And this episode promises to be another interesting one. Are you aware that this world has never ceased to amaze me? Well, you may not be aware. Sarcastically, it's something that I can only explain. But here I come, and I crave your indulgence and attention as we rediscover another important discussion. Throughout history, there has been one sobering truth, and that is, nations rarely collapse during wars. It sounds paradoxical, yeah? But indeed, nations only collapse after wars. Usually, it is after victory, that is, after independence, after constitutions are signed, after enemies retreat, that the real danger begins. And you might want to cast your mind back to several happenings, even for you as a person, within your own nation's historical background. We have seen repeatedly in modern history that post-colonial nations that won freedom also lost their identity. And we can give several examples, especially even in sub-Saharan Africa. We've seen again that revolutionary movements that succeeded military also failed morally. And unfortunately, leaders who held a nation together also had unity unraveling after their departure. Well, to get more precise, you can think about post-Mandela South Africa. You can also consider the post-Washington America, or even, for my dear Ghanaians, the post-Nkrumah Ghana. The question was never, can we win? No. But it has always been, can we remain faithful to what we've won? And that is the cry and question many countries even now still ask. In the tenets of biblical records, Joshua stood in that exact moment. Yes, the land is possessed. The enemies are subdued. The leader is old. Now history holds its breath. What will happen next? And that is our focus for this discourse as we go through the faithfulness of God with the Israelites. Clearly, it is important that we go through very significant lines by which we can clearly understand this episode. It is important for us to discuss the faithfulness of God, what it really means, and even in the context of current sojourn in our world today. Is God really faithful? We'll continue to discuss what God did and what He is going to do, even in the context of Joshua 23. Then, quickly look into the reward for faithfulness. Then, of course, the requirements that are necessary when we would want to reap the rewards of faithfulness. Then finally, as important as it is, we will now climax into the punishment for unfaithfulness. Let's continue. It is very significant for us to understand that Joshua does not begin with commands. In fact, he begins with an evidence. Before he spake, God had been put on trial. And that is what we see in a very important discourse as far as God is concerned. The faithfulness of God is brought into light. And here we have been taught that God had given Israel all the land. In fact, he had delivered into their hands all their enemies. It is noteworthy to highlight that there was a repetition of the word all. In fact, that word, when you look at Joshua chapter 21 verse 45, emphasizes God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promise. Indeed, he had fulfilled his promise. And all his works was for the good of his people. He had repeatedly remained faithful. He had promised to save them and give them the earth as their inheritance. Of course, nothing could refute the faithfulness that God had shown to the Israelites. But here comes the twist. You see, victory always has a memory problem. The greatest threat to Israel was no longer Canaanites. It was amnesia. And it sounds funny. Joshua knows something every seasoned leader learns. And that is, people forget who fought for them once they start enjoying peace. And you can take a critical look at the several histories, the several independence journeys of several nations in the world. How many of them turned away from even their founding fathers. So it is no surprise that Joshua shifts his narrative from what Israel has to what God has done. Now, as we move along, we see that power without faithfulness is a dangerous thing. And that is why history has shown repeatedly that strength untethered from values become tyranny. Joshua really understood this. So he warned Israel, your strength is conditional. A very empathetic speech. He begins by telling them what God had already done. And by this, he told all the congregation that God had fought against the nations. He told them that he had divided the land among the tribes. Joshua again told them that he would drive out the nations that are left. It was not a mere coincidence. All this, yes, all that had already been done and what was to be done was subject to a single condition on the part of Israel: obedience. He warns them, your strength is conditional. It will only be worthwhile if you obey. And we can all see that indeed the history of Israel has been a lesson for all of us. How obedience had led them to continually stay within the threshold of God's guidance, and how the opposite had been for them. The reward for faithfulness. In Joshua 23 verse 10 we read, one of you routs 1,000 because the Lord your God fights for you, just as he promised. Clearly, that one important theme throughout the biblical record is that love is the last command. Joshua does not end with fear, he ends with love. Because fear may restrain behavior, but only love sustains faithfulness. So in the context of the conquest of Canaan, faithfulness to God had to be manifested in 3 very specific ways. Number 1, the people were reminded not to marry the inhabitants of the land. That would be a very important foundation for faithfulness. Secondly, they were not to mention the names of their gods. Before I continue, let me give a simple explanation or exposition on these. In our context, marrying inhabitants of the land can transcend beyond doctrines, ideologies that are not welcome even in the context of what we have come to understand as the natural order of things. In the context of the character of God, we wouldn't want to stain our own images being created in God's image by connecting with cultures, things, and even ideologies that tend to tarnish the image God has created in us. And for a fact, mentioning the name of gods and even transcending from that, doing what these gods bid, were expressly forbidden. This really continues to be the order of the day even in our time. We are not to mention the names of other gods. And as we go along, it becomes clearer. Joshua tells them not to worship their gods. Of course, when you intermarry, in other words, when you welcome different doctrines, well, literally, you associate with unbelievers, and it tends to delineate you from the godly way of things. You would want to mention the name of the gods that you find, and in extension, of course, worship them. So Joshua quickly pointed out the significance of love, and in this case, he clarified that fear may restrain behavior, but it is only love that sustains faithfulness. Love for who? Love for God and God only. This is the foundation of what we must do. Joshua continues by clarifying the most uncomfortable truth. He does what few leaders dare to do. He speaks of consequences after success. And it's clear that the main point of Joshua's speech was to love God. But it was also imperative that he told the people and reminded them that covenant is not sentimental. It is binding. In fact, he goes on to propose an incentive to nurture that love. That is the faithfulness of God. And today, we have been privileged to have an even better incentive for this. And that is the example of Jesus. His love for all constitutes the framework for the manifestation of our faithfulness. Indeed, it doesn't end there. Joshua is about to die, but the covenant is not. The land will remain, the enemies may return, and it is noteworthy that he reminded them the punishment for unfaithfulness. What does Joshua do? He ends his speech with harsh words of warning about the consequences of disobedience. And basically, that is suffering the wrath of he who granted them what they are enjoying now. The land will remain, the enemies may even return. New generations will rise who never saw Egypt of Jericho. And they will have to decide without Joshua whether God is still worth trusting. This particular episode leaves us where every faithful generation must stand. Victory behind us, the choice before us. Like Joshua said, choose this day whom you will serve. Who shall you choose?